Hairspray is the musical that's very dear to my heart because in 2002 it received its world premiere at the Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle, where at the time I was serving as the producing artistic director. And this provided me with a one-of-a-kind inside view of the creation and development of that show from its first draft and early demo recording. I remember getting in the mail the demo being sent to me and putting it into my CD player. We still had those then. Uh, and continuing through that, through the staged readings, through the rehearsal period, the pre-Broadway tryout in Seattle, and on to its thrilling opening night on Broadway. But I want to emphasize the unlikely hit that Hairspray appeared to be at the time that we had to decide whether we were going to do it or not, whether we were going to host and produce the pre-Broadway tryout in Seattle. First of all, it was based on a quirky, only moderately well-known film whose writer and director, John Waters, was best known for making shockingly provocative cult films purposely intended to attack and offend middle-class values. Second, only one of the show's writers had ever written a Broadway musical before, and that was co-book writer Tom Meehan. And the only cast member, although it produced a number of stars, have come out of that show, uh, even out of the ensemble of that show, have become stars. Uh, at the time, only one of the cast members was of any note at all, and that was Harvey Fierstein. And even he had the limited profile outside of New York. In Seattle, Harvey Fierstein really didn't mean much to anybody. What was even more confusing when we were talking about the show at the time was that Harvey Fierstein was going to be playing the leading female character in the show, and how that was explained at the time. Again, before anybody knows what the show is, most people had not seen that movie that it was based on. The general public had not seen that movie. So it was a hard sell in some ways. Finally, Hairspray is and was at the time a wild, wacky, irreverent comedy that revolves around very serious issues, including body image, fat shaming, agoraphobia, racial prejudice, segregation, interracial relationships, class discrimination, and female empowerment, a combination that did not necessarily make it seem likely to become a major hit musical comedy. The driving force behind the show was my dear late friend, Margot Lyon, who I loved so much. And in several interviews, she described the genesis of Hairspray. And I'll just summarize this a little bit. She was looking to do a show basically because she wanted to do a show with a lot of dance in it, because the British musicals and the Sondheim musicals didn't dance. And she wanted a show that would feature dancing. So she was sick at home alone with the flu, and she had a bunch of movies, and she put in Hairspray and decided, oh, that's what I want to do. It had a larger than life character who wanted something and who had obstacles to overcome. But she still never imagined that a musical comedy based on a John Waters movie could ever become a massive mainstream hit. That was not in her view. She thought, we'll get up, maybe it'll be a minor hit. Maybe it will find an audience of some kind. But over a series of developmental stage readings of the book and the score for invited audiences, it became very clear, and I remember going to one of those, uh, that the creators of the show had tapped into something special and quickly started a feeding frenzy among potential investors. I was in that room, and I've never seen people run to throw money at a producer in the way they did at that time at the end of this presentation. It was unbelievable. That optimism was confirmed at the very first preview in Seattle when the audience screamed. And again, remember, this show has never been seen by anybody, and no one knows what the reaction to it will be. Looks like it could be good, but you just don't know. You really don't know until the audience shows up. So the audience screamed after the first number, and then screamed after every number as they came up. And I'll tell this story. I wasn't going to do it, but it's too good not to tell. There was a lot of controversy and disagreement among the producers and the authors of that show about the song I Know Where I've Been. And Margot especially was adamant that that song was too serious, too much of a downer, too much of an to fit into the musical comedy that they'd written. She thought it was a great song, but she was certain it was going to send the show down and it would never recover from that seriousness of that tone. And they, during the readings, they had it in, they had it out, they kept trying things. And finally, she made a deal. Marc Shaiman and Scott Whitman made a deal with her that they would at least try it at the first preview in Seattle and see whether how the audience reacted. And Margot and several of the other producers were like, "Well, we're going to try it. We'll see what happens, but it's not. It's got to go. It's got to go." So we get to the first preview, and I'm sitting next to Margot. And as I described it, the audience screamed after the number. They screamed after every number. And then we got to I Know Where I've Been. And uh, Mary Bond Davis, who was sensational, launches into that song. And the audience gets very quiet. And right before Margot starts, said, "Well, here we go." And so they do the song at the end of it, and I may have augmenting my memory of this, but I remember it ends and we're sort of like a dead silence. And then the audience screamed louder than they had screamed for any other number and just went crazy. And Margot turned to me and said, "Well, now we'll never get it out of the show." She would tell that story on herself for years afterwards because she understood that she was just so wrong about how that song, the effect of that song, and how the song really summarized the whole show and was really the point of the show. But it's such a great lesson in you don't know until you try it, and you can really have doubts. And Marc Shaiman and Scott Whitman, who were adamant that that song was going to work from the beginning, were absolutely right. Uh, at the third unforgettable preview of Hairspray in Seattle, which was attended by 300 members of the Seattle Men's Chorus. Even after the final curtain call was over and the cast had exited the stage, the audience refused to leave the theater and just kept applauding and in fact, they kept cheering and applauding until Harvey Fierstein finally came down back from his dressing room, which was up 2 flights of stairs, for one more triumphant bow in his robe. But he was already taken off his costume. And it sounds like a scene from a cheesy backstage musical, but it was absolutely real. This absolutely happened. I was there. I testify to it. Uh, and ever since, audiences have gone wild for Hairspray. Hairspray opened on Broadway in August of 2002, and it won 8 Tony Awards, including score, book, best director, best musical, and then it proceeded to run for nearly 6.5 years. Was adapted into a major motion picture in 2007, a live television musical in 2016, and in the review in the New York Times, I think perfectly captured the essence of how Hairspray and virtually all of the other 20th century musical comedies that we'll see in just a minute have followed, uh, have been able to accomplish with this reinvention of the musical comedy. He said that Hairspray succeeds in recreating the pleasures of old-fashioned musical comedy without seeming old-fashioned. Think of it as a postmodern musical. It's a work that incorporates elements of arch satire, kitsch, and camp, all those elements that have ruled pop culture for the past several decades, but it does it without the long, customary edges of jadedness and condescension. Together, Hairspray and the Full Monty and the producers inspired a vibrant stream of new-fashioned 21st century musical comedies that, as I think this chart makes evident, show no sign of letting up.